All right, so the latest controversy on the campaign is about this whole business of inheritance tax and redistribution of wealth. Are these sound economic ideas that are getting mired in politics, or are they just plain bad economic ideas which are getting mired in politics as well? Let me now go across to a renowned economist and former executive director with the International Monetary Fund. Dr. Surjit Bhalla is now joining us. Thank you very much, Dr. Bhalla, for speaking with us. So this whole idea of inheritance tax, which has been floated by Mr. Pitroda, first of all, he says it's there in the United States. He calls it an interesting idea. It's there in just all of 6 states out of 50 in the United States. Why do you believe that this is a bad idea? India has had inheritance tax in the past. Why did we abolish it?
We have had lots of bad ideas in the past, and we have abolished several of those bad ideas. Some of them are still continuing. So just because we had an inheritance tax in the past doesn't mean it should be applicable today. More to the point, look, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but we are in the stage of development where we should be celebrating the generation of wealth, the generation of jobs, the economy moving forward. Remember, the big idea has to be, when you tax, is redistribution, correct? You want to be able to redistribute. And that is one of the most celebrated policies around the world if you can achieve it. Now, you redistribute income. There are very few countries in the world that attempt to redistribute wealth, and for obvious reasons. As you said, we even tried it. So I think the concentration should be what has happened to income inequality, consumption inequality, and what is the government doing to redistribute towards the bottom half of the population or the bottom third, whichever.
Okay.
And I think in that regard, India has had a huge success story, especially over the last decade. For the first time that I have seen or studied for any country in the world, that inequality, consumption inequality, has gone down in India, according to the 22-23 Consumer Expenditure Survey. Now, inequalities don't go down. The reason they have gone down and why the data seem to be very accurate, look at the set of redistribution that has been done over the last decade. Starting off with food being given free to, mind you, 800 million people. Now, where did we get the 800 million from? It is according to the Food Security Act, which was passed in 2013. Now, I'm not a big supporter of the Food Security Act, but those are the facts. So the Food Security Act stipulated, passed by the Congress government, stipulated that 75% of rural India, regardless of their income or consumption level, would get free food, cereals, rice or wheat. And actually at that time, it was ₹2 or ₹1 per kilo. And 50% of urban India. Whoever lived in urban India now would get the free food. What has happened, and I think we've talked about it over the last decade or so, that basically prior to 2014, there was massive leakage in the distribution of food. And the call that it was the Congress party's own Rajiv Gandhi who had said in 1984, that 85 rather, the statement was made in 1985, that only 15 paise of every rupee went to the poor.
Correct.
Now it turns out that it's close to 85, 90 paise of every rupee meant for the poor has actually gone to the poor. And mind you,
Okay.
the poor
Dr. Bhalla, let me stick to this issue of income inequality. Today, Rahul Gandhi had a press conference, he had a speech here in Delhi, and he continues to insist that a large majority of India's wealth is controlled by a tiny minority of people. And if you look at, for example, the surveys, the PLFS survey that has come out, it says when UPA 1 was in power, which was in 2004, the top 1% people control 23.7% of India's wealth. In Modi 1.0, when Modi came to power in 2014, that jumped to 31.7%. And in Modi 2.0, the last figures we have for is 2022, the top 1% people control 33% of India's wealth. So Rahul Gandhi's grand idea is to take away all this wealth, this excess wealth, and redistribute it to 90% of Indians who he says need this wealth.
No, so he can say, or somebody else can say, they need this money. That was my whole point of going through the data of the PDS and then housing. That basically there has been a massive free housing program for the poor, or again, I don't want to say the poor, for the bottom 50% of the population. That's wealth. And as far as wealth is concerned, and I think we did this program with you also back in 2018, is in my book, The New Wealth of Nations, that I documented that for developing countries like ours, the most important form of wealth was education. It's not financial wealth. So if you take education and the improvements in education that have taken place, that's a retransfer. Housing, education, food, that's an enormous amount of income. After all, income is nothing more than flow from your wealthy assets. Whether these assets are given or controlled by the government or not, they are giving it to you. So you want to look at income, not wealth.
But can you explain to our viewers, and many are asking this on Twitter and stuff, you know, the UK has an estate tax. Like I said, about half a dozen states in the US have an estate tax. Many of these industrialists, when those industries were booming, were getting, you know, land at subsidized or IT parks at subsidized prices and so on. Why should India not have an inheritance tax? Explain this in layman terms. Why do you believe this is a bad idea?
Once we get to be a developed country, we can start discussing inheritance tax. Okay. We are nowhere close to being. It is 2047, after all, is when we are going to be a developed country, aspiring to be, and I think we'll achieve that. Once we get there, then let's talk about an inheritance tax. What, I mean, how many developing countries do you know that have an inheritance tax? The developing countries, the poor countries, the middle income countries, their entire concentration, correctly, is on uplifting of the poor, which many of them have done, including India, and then the development of the middle class. The middle class is the one that is doing the most amount of savings and is doing the most amount of generation of wealth.
So I come back to this issue because Rahul Gandhi seems to be banging on about this income inequality. And I want to go back to the Gini coefficient numbers. Now, there was an SBI report that was put out some years ago, which said that the Gini coefficient here in India had actually become better. So Gini coefficient is an indicator of equality and inequality. If it's 0, it's perfectly equal. If it's 1, it's perfectly unequal. So in 2014-15, when Mr. Modi came to office, it was 0.47. And in 22-23, which is what the last year that we have numbers for, it is 0.402. So it's come down by about 0.7% or so. Now, the point is, if you were to go, this is among the overall data, but if you were to break this down amongst wage workers, regular wage workers, and casual wage workers, there the Gini coefficient has gone up. This is the contention by the opposition parties.
No, look, let's look at the wage data. One big fact about the wage data that we get from the PLFS is that the category that has shown the largest increase in their consumption or in their income, even wages, which is income, has been the casual workers. The slowest increase in that, the PLFS data, is the salaried workers, who are the richest. There are three classes of workers: self-employed, casual, and the
Salary.
And the salaried workers, who are the richest, have shown the lowest increase in wages, rate of growth of real wages. So, look, my book is about how we distort data. Here's a classic example of distorting the data. When the data shows that the richest people in India have had the slowest rate of growth of income, and the poorest people in India have had the highest growth of income or wages,
so
then you come out with this.
Your solution to income inequality is A, upliftment of the poor, plugging the leakages of the welfare state, and as far as the middle class is concerned, to help continue generate wealth and jobs and so on. You wouldn't want to even think about redistributing income, as has been suggested by the Congress Party.
Look, I am a strong believer that societies, especially India, have to do redistribution with growth. You can't redistribute something unless you grow. So that's the responsibility of the state, to redistribute. Second, if I've also argued on exactly this, that Indian tax rates are too high. Whether we look at the GST or even income tax rates. So that's another form of, you want to redistribute, you first want to increase the pie. And you increase the pie because then there's greater compliance by the rich and by the middle class if you decrease tax rates, not if you increase. And second, the GST is also at a very high level, in my view. The average GST tax rate should be reduced to something like 12% or 13%.
Okay. All right. Dr. Surjit Bhalla, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us your thoughts on this raging controversy about this inheritance tax and, of course, this redistribution of wealth, which has, of course, become a big talking point on the campaign trail as well. So let's get more reactions also politically. Like I said, it started with the Prime Minister's attack on Sunday, and then, of course, there's been a back and forth between the Prime Minister, Rahul Gandhi, Priyanka Gandhi also weighing in on this whole business of redistribution of wealth, and now the latest controversy with Sam Pitroda saying that India should look at quote-unquote interesting ideas like the inheritance tax, which is there in some parts of the US.